The world is evolving at a faster pace than ever before. As we begin the path to recovery after worldwide disruption, this podcast explores how the design industry can adapt to changing expectations and create a better future for your businesses and consumers. I'm your co-host, Peter Marion, and you're listening to Create Tomorrow, the WGSN podcast. Cities are locations that take up an outsized space in our imaginations. They are places that ambitious and creative young people aspire to go to in order to succeed and find their place in the world. Perceptions about cities in the wake of the pandemic have changed. From New York being described by its soon-to-be former president as a lawless ghost town, to footage of the upper classes in Paris fleeing the density of their city towards their country homes. However, the city's role has been changing for some time now in the West, with accelerating rental costs and more precarious work driving young people to reconsider their aspirations. The forecasts that de-emphasize a physical presence in city offices are creating space for new visions of the city to emerge, ones that build towards a more humane, sustainable, and equitable future. To discuss what that will look like, I'm joined by some of my fantastic colleagues to discuss the future of the city in the wake of the global pandemic. I'll be joined by Athena Shen, Senior Strategist from Insight, and you're based in Shanghai. Hi, Athena. What's your favorite thing about living in Shanghai?
My favorite thing about living in Shanghai is all the really convenient apps. So basically, I can be a very lazy person and not go out at all, but get everything delivered to me. I think that's one of the best perks of Shanghai. Everything is digitized and, mobile centered. So that's one of the great things.
That is very enlightening, and I had no idea. Thanks for that. And we're also joined by Joe McGinn, who is the Senior Strategist on City by City. Joe, what's your favourite thing to do in London?
Well, I haven't been to London for a while. I live just outside the city, but I love the markets there. And one of my favourite markets was Maltby Street Market, which is just near Bermondsey Street. And just spending a day there, having breakfast, exploring the street, and then ending up at the White Cube, just up on Bermondsey Street, is my idea of a perfect day, actually. So I'm missing that. I'm missing the visits.
Oh, that sounds like a lovely day. I want to come out with you next time you're going and exploring London. And lastly, but obviously not least, we have Sarah Housley, who is the Senior Strategist on Lifestyle and Interiors. Now, Sarah, what is your favourite thing to do in London?
Hi, Peter. So my favourite thing to do is just to take advantage of all the culture, because we have some of the best culture in the world. So going to the theatre, going to the art galleries and museums. And the amazing thing about London is that a lot of the museums are free as well. So they're really accessible. There's a really great mix of people that go, and I'm missing the theatre and I'm missing the exhibitions at the moment.
And to kick off today, obviously we're talking about the future of the city, and it would be really remiss of me not to talk about that without the context of the newly relaunched City by City product that we've launched on WGSN. Joe, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, the new City by City is all about bringing cities to people's desks while we all can't travel anymore. And a lot of our clients now, they used to rely on travel for inspiration. And now they're having to work from home. And so the purpose of these new types of city guides, which we're calling virtual city guides, is to bring that inspiration to their desks. So it's kind of like your sort of really cool creative friend taking you around a city virtually. And we've got lots of video interviews in there. We've got some fantastic imagery. We've even got a music playlist. And it's really taking you around the coolest hot spots, the hidden gems in that city to explore it. And to see how, retailers and creatives are reacting to this whole new situation right now as well.
I love them. I'm finding them so inspirational, and they're really kind of hitting my desire for wanderlust, as we've been obviously stuck in our cities since the start of the year. And now to get into sort of the meat of the episode, I was just wondering, from your perspective, what role does the city play in societies and our imaginations, and how is that changing in the wake of COVID?
Cities have always been these kind of melting pots, haven't they, of culture, and that's, what is so exciting about them, and the creativity that happens there. And I think suddenly this has all sort of been challenged in the last few months. But I think what we're seeing is, from researching the cities and talking to people, is that it's still all going on. It hasn't died. It's just shifted. It's shifted to online, but the communities in cities are still really active. In fact, maybe even stronger than ever. You know, you're seeing these small businesses or artists or nightclub owners all coming together online and sort of supporting each other more than ever before. So I think there's still a lot of sort of that creative element going on in cities, and I think cities will remain hubs for creativity.
I think also in that it's one of those things where you start to think about the city really, because, it's that idea that we've had in recent years where cities have become increasingly expensive, obviously, and it's become really hard to buy into them, particularly if you're a sort of a young millennial. And in some respects, this sort of shift in the city is taking it back to something that feels a little bit more accessible and feels a little bit more like a community, as opposed to something that was becoming sort of quite a large monolith that was sort of being taken away from people that were young and creative and wanting to start something new.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely true. And I think it's a bit more, it feels like the grassroots of creativity is maybe regenerating again. And also, I think looking to the future, perhaps, rents will drop again. And that will mean that young people can start off their careers and the creatives can move back in, whereas before possibly they were squeezed out of those city centres.
And so in terms of, I guess, what the shape of the city might look like, Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about what the future city might start to evolve into in the wake of everything that's happening?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, as with so many things with the pandemic, the trends that we're seeing are bigger macro trends that have been accelerated by current circumstances. So we can't attribute absolutely everything that's happening to the coronavirus. There was a much longer term trend of cities decentralising, partly because rents were going sky high in the middle of the capital. So we were seeing secondary cities and tertiary cities becoming more attractive to all demographics, but we were also seeing suburbs and smaller communities and more local communities taking on some of the culture and some of the amenities that previously would be associated with really the centre of the city. And I think we're really going to continue to see that. So, Peter, you and I have spoken on this podcast before about more local lifestyles, and particularly for the future of the city, that means the 15-minute city, which is a concept that we're very enamoured with here at WGSN. So that's the idea that everything within your neighbourhood, everything you might need in terms of amenities or shops or cultural hubs, can be accessed within 15 minutes, whether that's by walking or using a bike or on public transport, so that the city becomes much closer to you. And that it's not so much about you going out to find the city, but about the city finding you. And I know that's a concept that you're really passionate about as well, Peter.
It is. It's something that I've written about as well in the past. And it's something also, I think, that Athena, you've been sort of thinking about really in terms of Shanghai as well, in terms of how people's behaviours have changed. Can you explain that a little bit further?
Yeah, so in Shanghai, I think we're probably on a different kind of trajectory because of how the pandemic was controlled. But I do feel like in Shanghai, we still see that sense of decentralization happening, but it's because of our connected apps that I mentioned at the beginning. I think with Shanghai, it's really interesting that you can buy something that's couple of miles away from you, but because it's delivered to you, it's still kind of decentralized in that sense. And I think people are just looking to explore more possibilities within Shanghai because of our apps. And I think that kind of contributes to the idea of smart cities as well. So I think in Shanghai, we're seeing it play out a bit differently, but because of government development plans, we're still seeing kind of more centralized development in terms of like retail and cultural institutions. But I think it's going in both ways. So we have like the grassroots people opening little local shops where you can access through mobile apps, but you still have these kind of more centralized developments that the government is still trying to push. So I think we're seeing it develop in both sides.
In terms of preparing those sorts of 15-minute cities, Sarah, can you tell us a little bit more about some of the attributes of these 15-minute spaces? Because I think it really is about different ways of living and working, isn't it?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's about work-life balance, which is something that we're all reassessing at the moment for different reasons across consumer groups and across countries. We are all thinking about this, but perhaps taking different approaches towards it. So people are very focused on the idea of somehow reducing their working hours, using their time more efficiently. Perhaps we don't need 2-hour commutes. Perhaps we can walk more, we can cycle more. And a big part of this, alongside the cultural amenities and the retail stores and the restaurants that need to be closer to us to make the 15-minute city a reality, is the idea of making a much greener city, which is really enabled by being less reliant on cars. So public transport, bikes, scooters, micromobility, walking. Everyone has been buying a bike. Everyone's been going out cycling with their kids or their dogs or their friends. It's become much more, transport is much more community focused at the moment. And that's something we're going to see going forward. We're seeing cities being really redesigned around shorter distances of transport. And that has the knock-on effect that we can use the extra space to re-green the city, which is great for climate reasons, but also for well-being and quality of life. So the 15-minute city and its implications has all of these knock-on effects that tie into these ongoing issues we have around spatial equity and the climate crisis. And it all comes together in one solution, which then gives us a much better work-life balance. So I think in terms of systems thinking, it holds a lot of solutions within it.
Sarah, I mean, you've just explained like, I think 10 to 5 different concepts in such an eloquent way, which I love. It's just like, you know, it really is that whole idea of like the systems sort of focus with that 15-minute city that has so many different benefits to our quality of life in so many different ways, because it is that sort of stuff where, you know, if you are living in a 15-minute city, you are connected to the people in it because you're living in your local community. I think, you know, all of us and a lot of the content that we've been producing on WGSN over the past 8 months or so has really been reflective of this shift of lifestyle that we've all been facing in terms of, you know, we are much more connected to each other, and we are, you know, there is sort of a really valuable human aspect to our life experience when we go into a shop and the guy behind the counter recognizes us because we go in there every day, and there's something very special and beautiful in that. And, you know, it's that idea I think we're moving away from of cities as being kind of anonymous spaces to cities as being places where you can be seen in a way that is quite nice. To move on, what are the attributes of attractive cities moving into the future going to be? Jo, maybe this is one for you.
Well, I think moving on from Sarah's point, I think, you know, the greenery and greening of cities makes a city more attractive. And we're already seeing that happening now in places like New York, where very quickly they've adapted to this new normal and taking, you know, restaurants outdoors. They've created in Paris as well, you know, that's been happening. They've created cycle routes, pedestrianised streets. And I think that's going to be a key element to making cities attractive and livable, is bringing in this green element, and then going even further with things like really rewilding projects in the middle of the city, and so sort of as that grows, I think cities will become more and more attractive places to live.
Can I give a hyper-local example, actually? So I'm from Leicester in the Midlands in the UK, and I've just found out that my home city is replacing all its bus stops with bus shelters that are going to be made of recycled plastic and are going to have grass on the roof so that bees can come and tend to the plants and the flowers, and they're going to be planted with biodiverse plants that are local to Leicester. So it's one tiny little development that really shows this wider direction we're heading in, that we are going to be wanting to be surrounded by nature more, and our city planners are going to be really focusing on ways to do that.
Yeah, and also repurposing, like old industrial spaces. Like I was reading about in Copenhagen, they've done this recycling plant that's got a dry ski slope on top of it, so it can now be used as something for leisure purposes. It's like you said, it's planning, isn't it? It's thinking, how can we use these functional spaces in better ways for the future?
I think one of the amazing things that's really happened in the last 8 months is how quickly infrastructure, or even sort of temporary infrastructure in terms of things like bike lanes and closing off streets in London specifically, to make them much more pedestrian friendly, and how quickly that's happened. Because, you know, traditionally you would have expected that sort of stuff to take place over sort of 5-year periods, but it's all happened in the space of 8 months, which I think is really amazing. And it has these sort of larger long-term benefits because people are sort of seeing the benefits of them and they don't want those things removed.
Yeah, so there's been research that has shown that technology adoption has been accelerated by 5 years during the pandemic, which is a really solid statistic to kind of hang your assumptions on that things are happening more quickly. But I think to your point, Peter, it also proves how much can be achieved by cities and by businesses and by corporations if they just put their mind to working really quickly and dynamically to adjust to a changing situation. And if we had that mentality towards the climate crisis that we've had towards the pandemic, we could affect so much change within the next 12 months, and we could move towards a much quicker time frame than the current climate pledges, which are all kind of 2030 onwards. So I think when we bring some dynamic ways of thinking in and some more systemic ways of thinking in, we can really affect change quickly. So the future of the city could be really, really bright in that regard.
I think, you know, I'm in the background right now just waving my hands around in celebration and agreeing with you really aggressively, because it's something that I've been thinking a lot about, is all of these changes that we've managed to make in the last 8 months as a result of COVID. It's like, well, why can't we start making those changes at that scale and at that speed around our other pressing issues around things like the climate crisis? But to come back to you, Jo, obviously you're an expert in cities and you know everything sort of around the sorts of things that people want to be doing in a city. And I was just wondering, what are the most attractive cities or emerging cities that you're seeing become quite special places in people's imagination and in places that they want to go to?
Well, at the moment, we're looking a lot towards Southeast Asia and seeing, looking to them partly to see how they've, really bounced back after COVID and how they're innovating so well. But also because they've got this kind of youthful, creative energy to them. And so we're looking, places like Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, Jakarta. We're about to do a city guide there. Just really seeing that cultural, creative energy thriving through a positivity and an optimism that perhaps we don't see so much of in Europe at the moment. So I think those cities are places to look at. Also, we're looking over in places like Medellin in Colombia and South American cities, which are also looking much more at sustainable, practices, and that's becoming sort of part of their practice in a more grassroots way as well, which is really exciting for us to see in different parts of the world.
That's fantastic. You're now sort of creating my post-COVID travel list, so thanks for that. But in terms of those sorts of places, what are some of the, uniting factors in them? I guess you've said creativity and young and grassroots, but are there any other sorts of things that bring them together thematically?
I think it's that energy and optimism that allows things to happen. And when a city is still kind of developing in that way, sometimes, if you have these great big cities that are really established, it's hard to affect change and it's hard to sort of have this kind of, experimental element. Whereas some of these cities have that, still developing quality and the energy and optimism that comes with that. It means that they can almost start afresh. Having said that, like I said before, we're seeing places like Paris and New York are being surprisingly innovative and really managing to adapt quickly. So I'm excited to see that as well, that even in those bigger cities, the changes can be made quickly. Yeah,
and I think it is that sense of optimism and excitement that that really allows the city to have that sort of outside space in people's collective imaginations. It's like, I just keep thinking back to, moving to London, 15 years ago from Melbourne in Australia. And it's just that idea of possibility and that anything can happen that makes them exciting. And I think that's the thing, I guess, that's possibly been a little bit challenged through this period is, you can't have those kind of serendipitous experiences where you're knocking into someone and you don't know how the night's going to end, and you might meet someone else that's creative or something like that. And the thing that sort of seems to unite these cities, and also I think, we're sort of seeing it. I mean, obviously we're not seeing it in London right now because we're back in lockdown, but in New York, seeing people on the streets partying as the sort of US presidential election was announced at the weekend. And it's just like, you see that sort of thing where people are hopeful and optimistic, and there is a possibility for a brighter future coming through. To move on to that sense of the smart city, and I know, Athena, that's something that you've been thinking about a lot, because obviously it's something that is really happening a lot in China. Can you tell us a little bit about what that might look like and what some of the developments are happening in that space?
I think a lot of the smart developments that are happening in Chinese cities kind of owes to this kind of unique digital ecosystem that China has, because it's very mobile driven, and there are a lot of super apps in China that everybody uses. So everybody uses WeChat to message each other, and a lot of people use Alipay. That's a mobile payments app by Alibaba. So I think one great example is how Alipay moved to launch health codes back at the beginning of the year when COVID was happening. So when cities in China were starting to open up, Alipay gave everybody health codes assigned according to where you've traveled. So this is based on, your travel data, and it tracks where you've been, and it, can tell if you've been into contact with people who are at high risk of the COVID infection. So that really helped, even though most of us didn't really understand the technology behind it, but it really did help to facilitate that feeling of safeness. So I think that really helped a lot of people in wanting to come back out onto the streets and wanting to go back into public transportation. And even until today, in Shanghai, even though life on the ground is fairly back to normal, you still need to show your health codes when you want to enter the metro station, if you want to enter public spaces. And a lot of shops still ask for a health code. So I think that really does seem to be staying with us for a while. And I think in China, we're also seeing apps, these mobile apps, driving a lot more innovation. So Shanghai also launched its citizen services. So it's a cloud citizen service app. So you can use it to register for a lot of city services, and you can use it to renew your identification card. So a lot of things in China are being consolidated digitally. But I think this kind of owes to the difference between Western countries and the East, as the idea of privacy and surveillance. I think people on the ground here sort of perceive it differently. But for me, I feel like it really does take a lot of consolidation, of all this data to really help make smart cities more efficient. So I think that's kind of where the catch comes in. So I'd be curious to know, how that might play out in Western countries where there's kind of a more resistant against that kind of like surveillance and data collection.
So, Athena, we've got contact tracing apps. So we have an app in London and in the UK where you're supposed to scan a QR code if you go into like a restaurant or a public space. And basically with that, if you do come into contact with someone else, you do get a notification, then you are told to sort of isolate. But I mean, I've been using that app for, I guess it's been out for maybe a month now, I would assume. And I keep getting these false positives where it sort of pops up and it says, you've been exposed, checking for level infection, and then nothing happens. And so it's just like, you're constantly getting these notifications on your phone suggesting that maybe you're in danger, but then nothing nothing comes of it. And so it's just creating this extended level of concern or fear. And I don't think it's maybe as sophisticated as the one that you've had in China, because I believe that that's just kind of done in the background and you're not having to scan things as you go different places. It just uses your location data. But then obviously, like you say, in the West, there is a very, very different attitude. And I think, Sarah, you can probably speak to this with some sort of level of passion around privacy and data protection.
Yeah, I think we have a big issue with trusting big corporations who are using data here in the West, and in trusting our governments as well, because one of the issues with the contact tracing app is that it's just been seen to be not very effective, and it's perceived that the government haven't handled its rollout or its development particularly effectively, whereas it sounds like you've had a much smoother process. And the fact that it's in the background feels much more intuitive to use rather than having to always be making it function yourself. I think there's going to be an ongoing conversation over the next decade where the West knows that we need to learn from Asia, who just use technology amazingly in a way that is so far advanced of our systems. But we also have real concerns about ethics, privacy, bias is a really big concern at the moment, particularly for things like facial recognition and speech analysis, things like that. And there's a lot to overcome and a lot to decode as we go forward. And so brands who are working in this space do need to be really careful in places like the US and Europe that they're treating the data with respect and they're treating their users with respect. But at the same time, we also really, really need to learn from China, who are just so advanced with the way they're working with this, particularly for the smart city.
And as we're talking about the future of the city, one of the things I think, Athena, you could speak really interestingly about is the sort of future of the sustainable city and cities that are being built with the future in mind. I'm thinking specifically of Xiong'an. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so Xiong'an is it's part of the Beijing government's plans to sort of like relocate more people into the suburbs, because Beijing is a massively crowded city. So it's kind of like looking to move people out of the central business districts and create this like self-functioning and self-fulfilling suburb. So in Xiong'an, the government has worked with a lot of local providers in trying to, they target to produce clean energy from solar energy for the city in the future, though it's still like quite a conceptual city, but like the plans for the cities are centered around sustainability, safety, and also smart technology. So smart technology also means that there will be a lot of sensors surrounding the city, because Beijing is known for its horrible traffic. So what the government plans to do is they plan to install a lot of smart sensors on the roads and the highways surrounding Xiong'an, and which will help to like facilitate a smoother traffic around it. So it's basically centered around these three: sustainability, safety, and smartness, that will contribute to kind of like creating this model city for the future in China. But I really think this will probably only work for smaller regions, and it won't completely, take over the mega cities such as Shanghai or Beijing, because definitely I think going back to what we were talking about culture, I definitely feel like these mega cities have a very special place and bring together people of different backgrounds and, different knowledges, and really connecting them creatively.
Absolutely. And I think, some of the stuff in Xiong'an is like, they've got, it's really low, the city, looking at the plans for it. It looks like it's only like sort of 4 or 5 stories tall. There's greenhouses on the roofs of the buildings. And I think in some of the plans, there's also co-working spaces that have digital factories and 3D printers and prototyping machines. So it is very much like, you could go in there and potentially never have to leave it, ideally, I guess, in theory, if you wanted to. Maybe that's not what we want, because obviously it is, there is so much creativity that happens and comes from people knocking up against each other. To that point, I guess, is one of the things that we've been sort of discussing, and one of the things that's been sort of theorized as a result of the pandemic, is that sort of increased shift to remote working, and also maybe the rise of secondary cities, and what that might mean because obviously, you know, our imaginations and our focuses have traditionally been on cities like New York, London, Paris, Sydney, Shanghai, you know, but potentially as people shift to more remote working, there might be larger opportunities in those secondary cities. And I was just wondering, from your perspectives, what sort of, what will that mean? Because I guess, you know, that will change how we interact with spaces. It will change, you know, and also, I guess, the sort of idea of these people moving from London or anywhere else into those secondary cities, there'll be a cultural adjustment as well. And I was just wondering what sort of things will need to change in those secondary cities to make them much more welcoming for people from those, I guess, first tier cities.
I think that's where the small businesses and those, you know, the creative elements of the big cities need to then sort of be injected into the smaller cities or those small towns as well. I think all those people moving out of the big cities will expect to have, you know, the exciting small independent boutiques or the great coffee shop or the sort of art house cinema, you know, all those things people will be wanting to find in the smaller cities. So I think that's quite exciting, you know, offers new possibilities for the high street and sort of bringing back that element of creativity that perhaps has been pushed aside a little bit in small towns and small cities.
Fantastic. And I think it's also about like helping people find community as well in those spaces so that there isn't so much of a, I guess, a cultural, I don't know, because I guess that whole thing about cities is that you find your group of people that share the same mindset. And if you're moving into a smaller city or a smaller town or whatever, you know, that means that becomes a little bit more challenging. And so it almost becomes, you know, that you're using, I guess, the internet to find community, or there are other ways, looking at other ways of creating more intentional communities through that.
I think, Peter, there's a really big role for neighbourhood technology to play in this as well. So we've seen apps like Nextdoor receive some criticism for kind of fostering, yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
For fostering perhaps prejudice and outdated perceptions of who's a good, in quotes, or bad neighbour. But they also have a real role to play in bringing communities together and getting people talking. And particularly apps like Olio, which was founded in the UK but is available internationally now, that let people give things away to each other. So you actually have to go and drop it off at someone's doorstep, or if you're able to, post-COVID, actually have a conversation with them. And Olio's just launched a platform for selling things that you've made as well. So it's tapping into that rise of crafting and DIY and sharing things with your neighbours in more of that small business way as well that Joe has spoken about. So it's really supporting those cottage industries that we're seeing springing up in people's houses. So definitely neighbourhood can be really enabled by technology.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really interesting aspect, because I do find, like, I'm on my local Nextdoor, and I do find some of the email updates that you get sent through quite concerning and amusing. But I think that I love the idea of Olio being used as a tool for connection, not just sort of getting rid of food that you don't want to eat and that you're not going to get through before the end of its sort of useful use by date. We're coming to the end of the episode, and I wanted to ask each of you what one short-term and long-term thing should companies be doing to adapt to the changing shape of the city. Athena, do you want to kick off?
One short term, I think what I find really interesting is how the idea of like working from home, because in Asia, it really wasn't a very widely accepted concept. But now we're really seeing a lot of companies allowing employees to, you know, work from home 2 days a week. And it's still happening, even though Shanghai has the virus mostly controlled. So I really think we're seeing a shift towards that, which I find very, you know, I'm really happy about that shift. You know, people have more time, because we know about the 996 trend, and people were just really crushed by, you know, not having that work and life balance. And I think in the long term, we're definitely looking at more sustainability. I think in China, what's interesting, because it's really mobile driven, and we have a lot of sharing apps. So what I've been seeing recently in Shanghai is a lot of people have been taking to writing bike sharing apps. So we're seeing the Shanghai city government really working to plan more biking routes. So I definitely think that, you know, in the long term, the idea of like commuting and how we get around cities is something that brands should also be looking at, because people are going to change the way they kind of move around the city. If they're biking more, if they're, you know, walking more, commuting in a different way, I think that's something that companies should also be looking at.
So for my short-term focus, I'd say really look at hygiene and emphasising safety, particularly for transport. So people are not going into cities because they've been really put off from using things like public transport or shared mobility. So we need to really be investing in those antiviral coatings, that kind of performative hygiene almost, where we really emphasize how clean things are and how safe these experiences can be if they're done responsibly and implemented responsibly. And that will help to revitalize the city in the short term. In the long term, I think we really need to look at the climate-friendly city. So all of that re-greening we've talked about, but also focusing on making sure it's really biodiverse and really native to that landscape, because we can plant as many parks and trees as we want, but if they're not actually contributing to biodiversity, they're not having a very strong climate impact. So that needs to be a real focus as we go forward as well.
And also being racially equitable as well. I think one of the things that we've been seeing is that there is a really sharp disparity, particularly in Western countries and cities, around, the different levels of socioeconomic and racial groups and access to green space. And there is a lot of work that needs to be done around that as well. Jo, what are yours?
I think in the short term, if you're a retailer or, a hospitality company, you should be looking at multi-purpose, multifunctional space. So how can you rethink your space quickly if there's another lockdown? How can you take your experience outside, or can you make some kind of pop-up element to it? And I think in the long term, you should be thinking more about multifunctional spaces in terms of, can you use the rooftop to create some kind of green garden or help with energy efficiency? How can you use the building in a more sustainable and multi-purpose way? So I think it is all about rethinking spaces and maximising them in that way.
And that's all we have time for today. Thanks for listening to the WGSN podcast. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, then please subscribe to us. You can find us on all major podcast platforms. And if you really like what you heard, then please leave us a rating and review. It really does help us to get the word out there. In our next episode, I'll be back with the team to talk about celebrating. But in the interim, if you want to learn more about what we've been talking about, then please head over to wgsn.com to find out how you can get access to much more insight and analysis. And if you're already a WGSN subscriber, head over to the site where we've pulled together all of our research on the changing city with key points from this podcast in one handy report. Thanks to our guests for being here, and I'd like to thank our show producers Roland Bodenham and Bethan Ryder. And again, thank you for being here. Please stay well and healthy, and we'll see you again next time. Bye.